Hey everybody, how are you doing? I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're getting excited for the end of the semester. Okay, so this is lecture 24, which means after this, all you have is one more lecture, chapter 25, and then our final exam, okay, which will be next week. So keep that in mind. Again, you guys will have the same time like always, 90 minutes, 50 questions. It'll be online, uh, open notes, open book, open internet. Okay, so start preparing for the final exam. Remember, it's only going to be on chapters 21 through 25. All right, that's just a heads up. Also, your papers are going to be due this Friday. I hope you guys are finding the topic entertaining. Some people will find it really easy. Some may find it a little difficult. So, but that's why I give you two options, or gave you two options to talk about to help you lengthen your paper. All right. So last time we talked about communities, okay, and chapter 23. Now we're going to talk about ecosystems and how they function, okay, and it is definitely the result of communities, okay, natural organismal communities. Okay, but it's not just that. You also need other components. Okay, so we're going to look at all the factors that influence or allow an ecosystem to be productive. Okay, so let's look at a case of an ecosystem that was destroyed. All right. If you don't remember this, is the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. It's one of our most devastating environmental accidents. Okay. This was an oil rig in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico that caught fire and started spewing oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, and I think it took. You're gonna want to double check this. I want to say that it took about 3 months for them to cap the oil well and prevent oil from spilling into the Gulf of Mexico. So this is an image of how vast that oil spill. In that time that the oil was spewing into the Gulf of Mexico, it released approximately 5 million, with an M, 5 million barrels of crude oil. Now, let's put that in perspective because that's a shit ton of oil, right? Um, Before the pandemic, when we were driving around on a regular basis, everybody was driving everywhere. Commerce, trade, people delivering anything and everything. 5 million barrels is about 1/4 of what the U.S. uses on a daily basis. 1/4. Okay. So that should put in perspective how much oil is being used on a daily basis in the United States. If 5 million barrels spilled into the Gulf of Mexico and created a devastating catastrophe for this ecosystem, okay, we use that's a quarter of what we use every day before the pandemic. Okay, that's probably a reason why we within a few weeks of us stay sheltering in place and staying at home and safer at home, you could start to see mountains and rivers clear up, and the Himalayas finally showed up in India again. Okay, um, that should give you also an idea of what the use of fossil fuels does to our planet. Okay, so like I said, this is a very detrimental accident. Okay, it killed numerous species initially. Okay, and they're still 9, 10 years out. They're still doing studies and still finding areas that are full of petroleum, especially in the deep water portions of the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so from this, they also found that numerous plant species died along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, which when the vegetation dies off, okay, you often get soil erosion because vegetation ends up keeping soil in place. So this is a very detrimental accident. That's why it's tagged death of an ecosystem. Okay, it hasn't really 10 years out, 9, 10 years out, it still hasn't fully recovered. They're still seeing the ramifications and the repercussions of this. One of the organisms that was severely impacted were the phyto and zooplankton. Okay, that is essentially your building block for all marine life in the ocean. So if you start to, and they are what we call keystone species. If you remove the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, you're going to have collapses of food webs eventually. Okay, so I know that's a kind of a downer, but it's just kind of one of those things that puts it into perspective. Okay, so let's take a look at ecosystems. Okay, how do they function? Okay, so an ecosystem consists of uh, all the natural communities and their physical environments that they share. Okay, so what do I want to show you? Okay, so here's ecosystem, and it's gonna consist of all the living organisms, so all the different animal communities, plant communities, and their interactions and how they interact with their physical environment as well. Okay, so when we talk about their living portions, the living portions of their ecosystem, we are talking about their biotic portion. Okay, so biotic is referring to the living portion of an ecosystem. Okay, so those are your animals, your prokaryotes, your protists, animal, fungi, plant, etc. Okay, let's highlight that up for you guys as well, because you guys should know this word. Okay, along with ecosystem. And the non-living portion of an ecosystem is going to be an abiotic factor or portion. Okay, and so an abiotic portion of an ecosystem is going to be the physical environment that all your living organisms are either connected to or living in or interacting with. Okay, so their atmosphere, the water, the Earth's crust, okay, the non-living components, okay, even atmosphere and weather. All right, so that's just a brief overview of what are the components that make up an ecosystem. Okay, so the other thing that we can see with an ecosystem is how relationships form. Okay, so I know in the last chapter we talked a lot about relationships and that can form in communities, predator prey, symbiosis. Um, what that ends up leading us to is how what we can infer is the energy that is flowing through the system. Okay, so we can see how energy is transferred. Okay, so one thing that you should remember about energy is that energy is transferred from one organism to another. One captures it, the other one, once they are consumed, they transfer it to another. Okay, so what you should remember about energy in an ecosystem is that it flows through an ecosystem. It is transferred from one individual to another. Okay, this is part of the reason why we cover thermodynamics within the first 2 chapters of the book, so you can get an understanding of how energy is harnessed or captured and then transferred from one. Because remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed; it can only be transferred, right? So for all organisms living in an ecosystem, they all need energy, right? And your most important organisms for capturing the biggest form of energy we have, solar radiation, are your producers. Okay, your plants, your green leafy friends. Okay, I know most people still don't like plants, and that's fine. Okay, but they are some of the most important organisms on the planet. They are the only or one of the few groups of organisms that are able to capture solar radiation and transform it into biologically useful energy. Okay, now all organisms are either directly or indirectly dependent on solar radiation, as well as carbon. Okay, and a few other chemical compounds and elements. Okay, so as producers capture this energy, it's passed on to consumers as the producers are eaten by consumers. Okay, but as that energy is transferred, some energy is always going to be lost. Okay, so the transfer of energy is not always going to be 100% from one individual to the next. Okay, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But energy is going to continue to flow, and you're going to have a loss of energy as the energy goes up in the dietary relationships. Okay, and that'll probably make sense in a little bit. Okay, what else do I want to say here? Was that it? That's about it. Okay. Okay. So if energy flows through an ecosystem, the one thing that ends up getting cycled through a system are nutrients or chemical compounds, okay, or chemical elements, okay. So nutrients are the chemical elements that organisms require to make either cells or certain components of their DNA. And so nutrients are cycled or recycled through an ecosystem, right? And so as the nutrients are pulled up by your producers when they take up soil, um, or yeah, when they take up nutrients from the soil, or it's found in the water, so they pull it up through the root system, right? They build them into larger macromolecules. They get used, and then they get broken down again, right? They get broken down to their basic chemical element form. So this is why we say nutrients are cycled or recycled through an ecosystem. Okay, so depending on the element, the chemical element, or the organism, certain nutrients are cycled through an ecosystem much faster than others. Okay, so there's always going to be a varying time range depending on the specific nutrient. Okay, so ecosystems definitely depend on energy capture, and your most important organisms for that are your plants that do photosynthesis, right? These are your organisms that store and capture energy from the sun and convert it into biologically useful energy such as carbohydrates. Okay. Now, certain areas will have much more productivity in the form of photosynthesis than others, right? So tropical rainforest ecosystems will be able to capture um, much more solar radiation than a desert ecosystem will. Okay, and that overall amount of capture can be traced. Right, we can end up figuring out how much is actually being captured, kind of through inference. Okay, so we look at a couple of things. Okay, but that amount of capture is also then available to other organisms in that ecosystem. Okay, so desert ecosystems capture relatively little, even though little solar energy, even though they are some of the um, what do I want to say? They are some of the most have some of the most available solar radiation on the planet. Right? They get a lot of sun. Okay, but they don't have the ability to capture solar radiation without a lot of leaves. Right? They can't do photosynthesis as well as plants in the tropical rainforest. Okay, so when we start to look at the energy captured by producers, we can actually figure out how much is actually being captured, and it's going to vary across the globe. Okay, so we start looking at something called net primary productivity. Okay, so this is the amount of energy acquired through photosynthesis. Okay, it's often referred to as NPP, net primary productivity. Okay, and so we can figure this out, the amount of energy that is acquired through photosynthesis, by looking at the amount of available growth and reproduction that has occurred afterwards. Okay, so we call that biomass. Okay, let me highlight this for you. Okay, biomass is what is referred to as the amount of growth that a producer new growth, I should say, amount of new growth that a producer um, has after conducting photosynthesis. And we have satellites in space that are able to track this. Okay, so we can see a lot of new growth in certain areas. Okay, especially when they have a high rate of solar radiation. Okay, so one thing, since solar radiation is one of the main driving factors for for biomass, okay, you should be able to understand that as solar radiation decreases from the equator to the poles, okay, then you would get a decrease in net primary productivity. Okay, so a lot of the areas that are what do I want to say, that show the highest rate of NPP or biomass. Yeah, that's the one I want to do. Okay, are going to be right here around the equator. Okay, so the areas in red on this map are going to show you are going to have the highest biomass production or net primary productivity. Okay, this is the solar radiation at the equator is the strongest, right? And as you go north or south from the equator, the amount of solar radiation decreases. Okay, so your areas closest to the equator, your tropical and subtropical areas, are going to have your highest rate of net primary productivity. Okay, so they're going to be able to do photosynthesis much more and have much more growth or biomass. Okay, pardon me. Okay, now what you should realize also is that in terrestrial ecosystems, you're going to see a lot more net net primary productivity. Excuse me. Um, as you get inland or in areas where there's definitely a lot of water, sunlight, temperature, and a decent amount of nutrients. Oops, I'm probably not going to be able to get that one. That's okay. Okay, so these are some factors down here that drive terrestrial net primary productivity. Okay, so there's got to be definitely a source of water or body of water, a good amount of sunlight, and varying temperatures. And probably your warmer temperatures are going to definitely help out here. Okay, and the amount of nutrients. This all affects your NPP or your net primary productivity. Now, we can measure this on land. We can also measure this in marine ecosystems. Okay, so we can measure the net primary productivity in the oceans. Okay, what we end up looking at is the amount of phytoplankton that is being produced. Okay, and so since those are the organisms doing photosynthesis, we can measure that amount of new biomass that is accumulating in the oceans. Okay, so the funny thing here is the open ocean. Okay, areas that are farthest away from land. Okay, like here and here and here and here. Okay, all your open ocean is going to show the lowest amount of net primary productivity. Okay, you're going to see much higher rates of primary productivity right around the coastlines. Okay, and if you're asking why, that's a good question. Why? Why would we start to see a good amount of net primary productivity in the ocean closest to the coastline? Okay, so if you're thinking, well, we have rains and there's runoff. That is definitely one of the reasons. We also have agriculture, where we supply the soil with nutrients as well, and we water, and there's also runoff, and all that runoff ends up running into the ocean. Okay, so those nutrients end up being used by the phytoplankton in the ocean. So this is part of the reason why we see a large amount of net primary productivity on the coastlines of most continents. Okay. Now, another thing that ends up driving net primary productivity in the ocean is something known as upwelling. Okay, now upwelling is an ocean current that typically pushes cold water up from the bottom. Now, this mixes the ocean floor, takes all the substrate and the sediment and mixes it up in the water column. Okay, so it pulls up all the nutrients from the ocean floor and brings it upward, replacing the warm water at the top or the surface of the ocean. And so that warm water that is being replaced by this nutrient-rich cold water is now going to cycle back down in a convection pattern to the floor and gain nutrients again, because the warm water has been depleted of most of its nutrients, I should say. Okay, so upwelling really helps out too with increasing that primary productivity, and a lot of times you see a lot of upwelling events occur on coastlines. Okay, so this is basically how we measure how productive certain areas are. Okay, and we just look at the amount of biomass that is going on. Okay, and we can infer if we look at and see how much new growth is occurring, we can infer how much energy capture is actually being acquired. Okay, now some of your most productive ecosystems on the planet are going to be found in the form of estuaries. Okay, they have they're very nutrient rich and they have a high rate of net primary productivity. Okay, so estuaries, again, if you don't remember, are aquatic regions where freshwater streams empty out into the ocean right along the coastline. So it's where a river finds its way to the ocean. Okay, now that should make sense to you that these are very nutrient rich and diverse ecosystems, because you have the combination of at least three different biomes. Okay, you have the wetlands biome, okay, and that the freshwater biome is running through, and then you have a meeting of freshwater biomes with a marine biome. Okay, so all of that combined helps in making these ecosystems very nutrient rich and very productive and very diverse. Okay, so that's part of the reasons why they are also so diverse as well. Okay, so you get a lot of phytoplankton, a lot of bird and fish species living in here, and a lot of um, dynamic life found in these estuaries. Okay, so since they're very diverse, we can also start to look at the relationships that are formed here. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of predator-prey relationships, a lot of symbiosis. Okay, that goes right along with chapter 22 in looking at the communities, right? Okay, so we can look at those relationships and start to understand energy transfer, okay, within the ecosystem. So we look at a couple things. We look at food chains, right? And so this explains food chain basically explains the relationship between one or two or maybe even three organisms and how they rely on each other. So it's definitely going to show you, like, let's take a very linear approach to it. So a food chain is very linear. Okay, it only explains a direct path or relationship. So you have the Chilean sea bass that is eaten by the leopard seal, and the leopard seal is eaten by a killer whale. Okay, so that's a food chain. Okay, it only explains one relationship or two relationships in an ecosystem. Okay, now if you have a very diverse ecosystem with a lot of different organisms, a lot of different species, to understand the relationships and the energy transfer that is going on in that ecosystem, you're going to want to look at something known as a food web. A food web is a great representation of the life that is found within, and the diverse life that is found within an ecosystem. And not only does it explain relationships, but it shows energy transfer from the lowest life form, okay, your producers, the individuals that are able to capture solar radiation, all the way up through the many different organisms that are associated in this ecosystem. Okay, so it shows how they're all connected to one another. Okay, so if you lose one individual, a lot of times somebody that is not directly but indirectly connected will be affected by this as well. Okay, so this is a food web over here. Okay, and you can see all these arrows are pointing in every which direction, right? So let's look at the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is eaten by this snail or krill, right? And you have squid and penguin. Okay, this is how food webs should look. Food web should be very chaotic and complex. There should be numerous individuals in this or a food web. Okay, it should show diversity. Okay, so the arrows here. So for the phytoplankton, you have a red arrow that is going from the phytoplankton to the krill. Okay, and then you have the krill that has a red arrow going from the krill to the crab-eater seal. Okay, and then a red arrow from the seal going to the killer whale. Okay, or crab-eater seal. Sorry. What this arrow is showing you is not only is it showing a relationship between all these individuals, but it is also showing energy transfer. The energy that this individual phytoplankton was able to capture from the sun is then being transferred to this krill. Okay, as the krill eats the phytoplankton. As the phytoplankton gains energy, the energy is then transferred to this crab-eater seal, okay? And the crab-eater seal now gains that energy from the krill individual. Okay. Now, when the crab eater seal gets eaten by the killer whale, that killer whale now has received the energy from the crab eater seal. Okay, so that's how the arrows work in a food web. Okay, the arrows uh, don't mean that the phytoplankton eats the krill. No, it's showing you the flow of energy from one individual to the other. Okay, so the krill will definitely eat the phytoplankton, and the energy from the phytoplankton is going to the krill, and so on and so on and so forth. Okay, so in lab we used to have an exercise where we would have you guys create your own food webs, and um, you were given a numerous different species and told to show the different relationships on a piece of paper. And at the end of the lab, when I checked your guys' work, if it showed a very chaotic mess of arrows going in every which direction, then you did it right. Okay, so that is exactly how that is supposed to look. Okay, now another way that we end up looking at energy and how it's captured and transferred from one individual to another, okay, we look at something known as an energy pyramid. Okay, so it shows the amount of energy transfer within a food chain or even in a food web. Okay, so it starts to look at what we call trophic levels. Okay, now trophic levels are basically how we represent certain individuals and where they feed. Okay, so we're going to have, let's see, let's highlight these out. I hope I can do this. All right. Okay, so you're going to have at the bottom of your pyramid, you're going to have producers. Okay, so producers are going to be your individuals that capture solar radiation and transform that energy into biologically useful energy. Okay, after that, you're going to have something known as primary consumers. Now, primary consumers eat or consume producers, right? Let me see. How do I want to do this? So I'm going to draw a red arrow from the producers on up to the primary consumers, showing you that the energy is going from the producers to the primary consumers. Okay, so that's just to keep in line with the food web diagram that we had on the previous slide. Okay, after that, where are we at? Highlighter. Oops. Okay, after that, you have what are known as secondary consumers. Now, secondary consumers are organisms that eat your primary consumers. Okay, so we're going to have energy flowing from these individuals, like that, right? And lastly, you have something known as tertiary consumers. And tertiary, and a lot of times that's the end of the trophic levels in an ecosystem. Okay, there is such a thing as a quaternary consumer, but it's got to be an extremely diverse ecosystem for that to occur. Okay, and so for what do I want to show you? There we go. Okay, the energy, since tertiary consumers, they're typically your top predators, the individuals that control the numbers of other organisms. Okay, the energy is going to go from secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. Okay, so you can see here in this image, you have an owl that's being depicted as a top predator, and that's true. Owls will eat other birds, they'll eat other rodents, or just rodents in general. You name it, owls will basically pick it off and eat it. Okay, so that is how we look at the energy transfer from one organisms to another when looking at the energy pyramid. Okay, so it shows you, but the other thing that also shows you is the amount of energy available that is passed on from one organism to the other as that energy is transferred. Okay, and I hope you remember, or at least heard me say, that when energy is transferred from one organism to another, it's not completely 100%. Actually, it's way less than 100%. Okay, and part of the reason the energy transfer from one organism to another is not 100% is because it gets lost. It gets lost in a couple different forms. Okay, so when you consume energy, that energy is being used to go towards maintenance and repair of your cellular processes and your tissues, right? So that's one way that you transfer, you lose energy. Oops, excuse me. Okay. A lot of uh, the energy that is lost in an organism is due to metabolic heat. Okay, so because your body is metabolizing the food that you have consumed, a lot of that energy is lost in the form of heat, body heat. Okay, and it's a large chunk of it. Okay, um, think of your body as an engine. Engines are only about 30 to 40% efficient, probably even less than that. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the fuel that is being um, utilized in an engine to allow it to go is being lost in the form of heat. Okay, your body's essentially the same way. So you're losing a lot of energy. We're not that efficient because of metabolic heat. Okay, and then a good chunk of it is also lost to indigestible food waste. Okay. And if you went, huh? That's okay. But I'll break it down to you when your book is clarifying indigestible food waste, right? Oops, excuse me, wrong one. I want a highlighter. Okay. Ugh, you prick. Okay. There we go. I'll get this, I swear. Okay. Indigestible is referring to waste or poop. Okay, the stuff that your body doesn't metabolize doesn't stay in your body. You end up pooping it up. Okay, so you do get a lot of energy that is lost in that form as well because it's not being used. It hasn't been metabolized or broken down. So you get a lot of energy loss in the form of indigestible food or poop. Okay, so the amount of energy that is actually transferable from one organism to the other is roughly about 10%. So we have the rule of 10%. When when energy is transferred from one trophic level to the other, it's only about 10%. Okay, so if you look down here at the bottom, okay, you have producers. Okay, and this is in kilocalories, right? So the amount of energy that is found within this grass is about 10,000 kilocalories. A grasshopper comes along and eats that energy and only receives about 1,000 kilocalories. Okay, so the grasshopper eats its fill. A bird comes along, or this cardinal comes along and eats a grasshopper. And the cardinal will only receive about 100 kilocalories of energy. Okay, an owl will come along and eat this cardinal, and you can see it right here in the owl's mouth. That's the cardinal. The owl will receive only 10 kilocalories, okay, of energy. So your top predators receive the least amount of energy in the trophic pyramid. Okay, this is kind of also the reason why they end up consuming quite a bit more, because they don't receive the amount of energy that they actually need. Okay, this is also why certain organisms do essentially a cost benefit ratio. How much energy is it going to take for me to capture this organism, and is it worth the expenditure of that energy? Is it going to benefit me enough? Okay, so a lot of your organisms, especially predators, will take that into account. Am I going to waste too much energy trying to get this food item? Okay, and that's probably for another lecture. We'll probably no, I think we can leave that here. Okay, so that's the energy pyramid, and that's how we basically see it. Okay, now the one thing that is left off of the energy pyramid, which is funny enough, is that we don't really see decomposers in this here. Okay, but decomposers are going to be one of your most important organisms found in your ecosystem. Okay, um, and the reason for that is because they're going to break down all your dead and decaying organisms or biomass, right? And so we can look at something else associated with an ecosystem known as secondary productivity. This is the rate of new biomass production that is acquired or generated by consumers. So new organisms, new individuals are brought into a community. The amount of or the rate at which decomposers are breaking down substances. Okay, so you can see a lot of a high rate of secondary productivity among decomposers. Okay, so eventually all the biomass ends up being consumed by decomposers, right? So this diagram, you can see energy is lost as metabolic heat at each trophic level, right? You can see some heat loss down in the forest at your producers, your consumers. You definitely have a lot of heat loss, okay? But when it comes to your decomposers, you have a lot of secondary primary productivity, right? They replicate at a high rate, especially when there's a lot of food or decaying matter that they get to break down, and they end up putting off a lot of heat. If you've ever stood next to a compost pile, okay, it's very, very, very warm. In the wintertime, if you're next to a compost pile, you should be able to see steam coming up from it. Okay, and that's because they're breaking down almost every, or basically all parts of things. Okay, so they're metabolizing quite a bit and breaking things down, returning it back to the soil, and they're losing a lot of heat in the process. Okay, so um, decomposers probably use about 80% of the net primary productivity in any given ecosystem, approximately. So if they use the majority, then your consumers are going to use about 20%. Okay, so it's very skewed towards the decomposers on who uses the most net primary productivity that is produced in any given ecosystem. Okay, so because decomposers are so important, okay, they break all things down, right, and return the basic element components back to the abiotic world. How do they actually move the nutrients back and forth between the abiotic and the biotic world? Okay, so a lot of times these nutrients are introduced into the biotic world by your producers, right? They're the ones that take up nutrients from the soil and water and air to help support or supplement their growth and reproduction, right? And so consumers end up utilizing those nutrients that producers brought up or took in and use those nutrients to make their own building blocks, their own macromolecules, right? And so as consumers end up dying off, okay, whatever's left over is left to the decomposers. And so the decomposers will metabolize and break down the remaining components or parts of a consumer and return all those nutrients back to the abiotic world, back to the soil, back to the air, okay, or and so they break down all this organic matter. Okay, so those nutrients will then travel into either an exchange pool or reservoir. Okay, and so they can be brought back up, okay, through producers or through human activity. Okay, so it is important to know that some of these nutrients, like I said, have a cycle. Right, these nutrient cycles differ depending on the element that is needed for certain organisms. Okay, so we have what are called biogeochemical cycles. Okay, these are nutrients that are transferred from organisms or between organisms and the physical environment. Okay, they can be referred to as nutrient cycles as well, and they have a cyclical pattern. Okay, so I hope you're laughing at the deer peeing here, but this is showing you a cyclical pattern of nitrogen. Okay, because when an organism pees, they're usually peeing out urea, which is a nitrogen-based compound. Okay, so the pee goes into the soil, it's returned to the soil, and then that nitrogen found in urea is broken down by decomposers, and then it's left in the soil, which is then taken up by uh, grass or producers, right? And then the producers grow, and that nutrient of nitrogen is still in the grass. Well, then the deer comes along and eats the grass. Okay, so that's essentially a cyclical pattern of the nitrogen cycle. It's a little bit more complex or a little bit more in depth other than that, but that is a basic view of a biogeochemical cycle. Okay, so each component or each element is different. The, some have atmospheric cycles, and so they will be found in the air, such as nitrogen, okay, and carbon, okay, and then some have sedimentary cycles like phosphorus. Okay, so we're going to take a look at these cycles, and so these are some of the most important biogeochemical cycles we have on the planet. Okay, so the first one is the carbon cycle, right? And So this is the transfer of carbon within communities. Okay, and you can see the purple arrows show you the natural pathway of carbon cycling from one organism to the other, from the abiotic to the biotic world and back again. Okay, and then you have also human interactions. Okay, which is represented in the red arrows. Okay, so the carbon cycle was driven by photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Excuse me, I apologize for that. Okay, so producers are going to photosynthesize. They're going to capture atmospheric CO2, and they're going to sequester that into their body and utilize that to make carbohydrates, right? Okay, those carbohydrates are then going to be used to produce other compounds and go through cellular respiration and release oxygen. Okay, so then as those producers die off, they're going to be decomposed, and that nutrient or carbon is going to be put back into the soil. Okay, so it goes from abiotic to biotic to abiotic again. Okay, so that is basically the gist of the carbon cycle, and it's solely driven. I want to make sure you guys get this. Come on, there you are. Okay, yeah, we'll say that. Okay, by photosynthesis and respiration, or cellular respiration. Okay, next we have the nitrogen cycle. Okay, now nitrogen is abundant in the air as N2. Okay, so that's it's atmospheric atmospheric nitrogen. About 70% of the air that we breathe, or 78%, excuse me, is nitrogen. Okay, remember there's only 21% oxygen in the atmosphere that we breathe. Okay, so it's very abundant. It has an atmospheric cycle. Okay, so it's very hard to get it from the atmosphere into the soil. A lot of times we end up relying on symbiosis and other single-celled organisms to help fix nitrogen into the soil. That's known as nitrogen fixation. Okay, so it pulls in atmospheric nitrogen and then converts it into another form, an organic form known as ammonia. Ammonia, excuse me. No, ammonium. I was right. Ammonium, okay, which is then sequestered into the soil and then able, in that form of ammonium, it's able to be used by producers to produce proteins and amino acids. Okay, so that a lot of times a bacteria found in what are known as root nodules in plants are responsible for fixing nitrogen into the soil. Okay, beans or legumes are plants that have root nodules that fix nitrogen into the soil. So a lot of farmers, when they grow a crop, when they rotate their crops, let's say they grew corn in the field at the beginning of the year, and after they harvest, they grow beans in there because the beans or the legume plants will put nitrogen back into the soil. Okay, and then they'll rotate back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so that's a great benefit to them. Okay, so here we go. Nitrogen fixation is an important cycle. Okay, because we need nitrogen to make proteins and amino acids, right? Okay, so you can see the natural pathway of atmospheric nitrogen being taken in by biotic organisms, right? And then being put into the soil, right? You can see this pathway over here. Okay, and nitrogen is being put into the soil by bacteria. Okay, it then can be pulled up or brought out of the soil by decomposers. Okay, it can then be bubbled into pools of water. Okay, same thing. They could have waste and decay, and so the decomposers will be able to break down the nitrogen compounds found in decaying matter. Okay, now we also have non-natural or human influence pathways. Okay, you can have industrial nitrogen fixation found over here. Okay, by factories. Okay, or you can have nitrogen put back into the air through combustion, nitrogen runoff. Okay, as a result of us putting fertilizer into our soil or producing fertilizer. Okay, so part of the reason we have fertilizer is so that we can add nitrogen back to the soil. Okay, now industrial production of nitrogen is much greater than the natural pathway. Okay, so we've kind of upended that process a little bit. All right, let's see what's next. Okay, the sulfur cycle. Okay, now the sulfur cycle doesn't seem like it's an important cycle, but it is. There are certain compounds that need sulfur, um, and chemical structures that need sulfur to be made into a bigger macromolecule. Okay, so sulfur enters the atmosphere from the oceans through salt spray. Okay, a lot of the sulfur gets into the atmosphere through salt spray or sea spray. Okay, um, okay. So this is one of the other chemical elements that has an atmospheric portion. You can also get sulfur into the air through volcanic activity, right? So a lot of times sulfur is associated with volcanoes. Okay, but when it goes into the air, it can be pulled into other organisms like plants and your producers. Okay, and they can utilize it to make other compounds needed for cellular processes. Okay, so and then let's see what we have there. The phosphorus cycle. Okay, so this is a major nutrient that is found in fertilizers. Okay, and a lot of times your many organisms need phosphorus, right? Well, if you think about it, the DNA structure relies on phosphorus as being a component of the DNA backbone, right? So this is why this uh, uh, biochemical cycle is extremely important. Okay, so we have natural pathways between excuse me. Okay, so between plant crops, okay, and animals eating plants and the animals being decomposed and putting the phosphorus back into the soil. Okay, when you have an area that is depleted of phosphorus, a lot of times your plants are not going to grow well. Okay, and certain plants require more phosphorus than others. Okay, so we will mine phosphorus, or we will also make fertilizers that contain phosphorus. Okay, so the non-natural pathways are us mining and creating fertilizer, and the fertilizer on the ground will often um, carry off into other areas when it rains or we irrigate the fields. Okay, so there's runoff associated with phosphorus fertilizers as well. Okay, so when phosphorus runs off into bodies of water, a lot of times it ends up stemming or causing a overgrowth of algae in water systems. Okay, so that's kind of the bad thing of associated with the phosphorus cycle is when we have a large runoff of phosphorus, it ends up um, bringing about huge algal blooms. Okay, so which leads us into basically how human actions can alter ecosystems. Okay, that was kind of one of the ways. Okay, but human actions can definitely alter ecosystems, and a lot of times for the worse. Okay, just in the past 200 years, we have changed numerous ecosystems on large scales. Um, um, okay, just from the 80s alone. Okay, with very loose environmental protection ordinances and guidelines, from mining practices. It really ended up changing a lot of these biogeochemical cycles. Okay, a lot of times what ends up happening is you could have well, in the 80s, we had something known as acid rain. Okay, especially in the northern East Coast where we had a lot of mines, coal mines, sulfur mines, stuff like that. And so these products from the mines, the mining of certain compounds like sulfur dioxide, or from industrial fabrication plants would release a lot of sulfur dioxide into the air. And so that sulfur dioxide would then mix with water, creating sulfuric acid. Okay, and so it's rather detrimental to the environment, to a number of structures when you have sulfuric acid pouring down on you. And now sulfuric acid is one of the strongest acids we have on the planet. So that's part of the reason why it would disrupt natural processes and ecosystems. Okay, so human activities like over fertilization of agricultural lands, um, can increase or decrease the net primary productivity of an ecosystem. Okay, so the nitrogen runoff and the phosphorus runoff, uh, when we use those nitrogen fertilizers and phosphorus fertilizers, and they run off into streams or bodies of water, oceans, lakes, okay, a lot of times you get rapid algal bloom or rapid algal growth, right? Okay, now sometimes that's not always a bad thing, but if it's covering the entire surface of your water at one point, not all your organisms are going to be able to eat all that algae. And so what ends up happening is you have these algal blooms that end up dying off. And so you get a lot of decaying algae that ends up falling through the water column down to the bottom. And so you get an overgrowth of decomposers that are utilizing this dead decaying algae. And what that does, those decomposers, right, they end up depleting the oxygen in the water. That's a bad thing because most of the organisms in the water system end up relying on the oxygen in the water to breathe. So it ends up creating an anaerobic condition, a lack of oxygen, which kills off numerous fish and other marine or aquatic organisms. Okay, so then you have a much greater condition that is caused as a result of this. Okay, so a lot of times when you have these rapid algal blooms, they're referred to as eutrophication. Okay, so it's abundant algae growth. Okay, that is caused by nutrient runoff a lot of times, and so this is an increase of the net primary productivity when you have this nutrient runoff and causes these algal blooms. Okay, but when let me see if I can get this out of the way. Okay, darn it. Right after you have that increase of net primary productivity with the algal bloom, you get a rapid decrease in net primary productivity when you get this mass die-off and anaerobic condition. Okay, so it kills multiple individuals of fish and other animals, and so you get a decrease in net primary productivity. Okay, so that's how human activities can alter or increase or decrease in that primary productivity. Yeah, it may increase it, but you're going to have the consequence of a decrease right after. Okay, so that's one example. Okay, again, this is going to be nutrient runoff. That's going to be showing you how another grand example of how nutrient runoff can affect the ecosystem. Okay, so when we have excessive nutrient runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus, okay, especially in this area of the Mississippi, right, that leads into the Gulf of Mexico, okay, that nutrient runoff causes eutrophication, a huge algal bloom, which then it's a rapid growth or increase of that net primary productivity, but since not all of that is going to be utilized or eaten or metabolized, or it ends up getting dying off and being broken down by decomposers, right? So those decomposers then deplete the oxygen in the water again, right? So you get all this oxygen being depleted, which means you get mass die-offs of numerous organisms in one area. Okay, so the red here, okay, is showing you the amount of die-off that is seen on the coastline as a result of nutrient runoff. Okay, and that's a large scale decrease of net primary productivity. Okay, so they're often referred to as dead zones because these areas, this is a delta, this is an estuary, right? This should be teeming with life, right? This should have numerous and diverse organismal species in this area, and it's not. It's what we call a dead zone. There's no life. There's no organisms really living there, and if they are, they're probably not having a very good life to begin with as a result of these dead zones. Okay, so they're very devastating. Okay, we've seen nutrient runoff that has occurred because of other human activities, not just from agriculture and over fertilization, but it's also seen with deforestation. Okay, so we used to clear cut forests. Okay, and so this is a great example of what a clear-cut forest is. It's basically you have loggers that come in and cut every living tree down that they essentially can see in a given area. Okay, so this image A is showing you experimental field. Okay, so but this is what clear cutting would look like in a forest. Okay, it'd be these huge swaths of lands that were just completely had every tree removed. They were just all cut down, and you'd leave this bare patch of land. Okay, now it's great for the loggers. They make a living, which is great. We have lumber. However, it ends up being extremely detrimental to the overall ecosystem. Okay, so I'm pretty sure you heard me say this before. Having vegetation in place keeps soil in place, okay, which also keeps nutrients in place. And when you clear cut a forest like this leaves all this soil here loose and able to be depleted or leached out for using the proper word. Okay, so when it rains, or you have, and these are areas a lot of times that have a lot of rain, the water will run across the soil and take all the sediment, all the substrate, and all the nutrients out of the soil. Okay, so what you're looking at is information from a study that was done. They had two patches of land next to a stream. Okay, and so they clear cut one area. That was your experimental plot, right? They took out all the trees, right? And they had another area not too far over upstream, okay, that they didn't clear cut. They left it alone. And then they put some what we call data loggers or probes in the water, and they looked at the amount of nitrogen or nitrate that was uh, running um, running off into the soil. So they clear cut here. Okay, and then they waited for the next rain event, and the next rain event was rather heavy. Okay, and the control group in green, the amount of nitrogen found in the streams or the waterway was very little to none. Okay, the waterway that it was next to which was the same stream, um, that was closest to the clear cut plot, had a large amount of nitrate that was leached out of the soil. Okay, so look at, you have a huge spike of nitrate that was taken out of the soil. Okay, so that's nitrogen not in the soil and now in the water. Okay, now it went down and then they clear cut again. Okay, so trees started to come back and then they clear cut it again. So then again, this is experimental plot. And then after they removed all the plant life from this field again, or this plot, next rainstorm, you get a huge spike of nitrogen or nitrate running off into the soil. Okay, so having vegetation in place is good. Okay, it keeps soil and nutrients where it's supposed to be and not in the streams. Okay, which then if it goes into the stream and it runs off, you can get mass die-offs or dead zones again in the ocean. Okay, other types of human activity occurred when we were mining. Okay, so most of your industrial plants often were burning fossil fuels, coal and wood, okay, and oil, and what that would do is release sulfur dioxide into the air. And like I said, when it mixes with water, it creates sulfuric acid, or creating acid rain. Okay, what it ends up doing is it ends up burning the leaves, right, and then acidifying the soil. So it has a twofold effect. Not only does it destroy the foliage in plant lives, but it also acidifies the soil to the point where nothing can really grow back. Okay, so this is another effect of human activity that alters an ecosystem. Okay, all right, that is what I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed that, and just remember that's chapter 24, and we have one more chapter after this, and then we're going to be done with the semester very shortly. Okay, good luck on your papers, good luck on the lab work, and if I don't hear from you soon, definitely good luck on the final exam. All right, I'll talk to you guys later.